Welcome to the Book of Mormon Evidence podcast with host Rod Meldrum. This week's Come Follow Me supplemental study is
Lesson 16, Mosiah chapter 4 through 6, A Mighty Change.
Jonathan Neville is a lawyer, businessman, educator, and author who has written over 40 books, including both nonfiction and fiction. We're really excited to have Jonathan Neville back with us. He recently spoke at the virtual expo that we post online at comefollowme2020.org. Listen in as he discusses Does Church History Matter? And the joyful evidence of the Book of Mormon, a little bit from the 27 trips he's taken since last November. He and his wife Beverly have been on some pretty exciting adventures in Asian countries especially. In this episode, Jonathan will discuss why is there one Cumorah and what his research has shown about some facts in church history that few members of the church even know.
Welcome to another edition of our Come Follow Me supplemental series podcast. And we have with us here Jonathan Neville. And we're excited about talking with you about some additional information that has to do with the place where the plates were actually located.
Right.
And then this place called Cumorah that is mentioned numerous times throughout the Book of Mormon as the place where the Jaredites had put their record and so forth, and where their civilization came to its end, where the Nephite civilization came to its end, and then there's and prophets and apostles have over and over again talked about this hill in Palmyra, New York area as being that hill. There are some scholars basically in the church who disagree with the prophets and what Joseph Smith said basically about these things. They say, well, wait a minute, but you're saying, but what's interesting is that there's been a new information that hasn't really been, it's always been there.
It's not widely known,
but it's not widely known.
Right.
But I think there's actually been a deliberate effort to try to actually withhold this information from members of the church, because it basically blows away that scholarly idea that the Book of Mormon's Hill Cumorah is someplace down in Central America and not the Hill Cumorah in New York.
Yeah.
So for our reference today, we're going to be talking about several pages that are in the annotated edition of the Book of Mormon. If you go back in the appendices here, this starts on page 512. And then it goes several pages. You actually have Oliver Cowdery's letter 7, which is what we're going to be talking about here more in detail. And so it's all in here if you already have the annotated Book of Mormon. If not, go get your copy. Get a copy from Deseret Book or Costco or our website at bookofmormonevidence.org, or there's other places as well. And getting yourself a copy. And then it goes into, so there's about 4 pages of that. Then 5 pages of that. Then we have a whole section on prophets and apostles speak on the Hill Cumorah in America, and that starts on page 517 and has statements here from James E. Talmage and George Albert Smith, Orson Pratt, Ezra Taft Benson, that talks about the Hill Cumorah monument and how that came about and what happened on the day of that, and some of the revelations and things that happened there. The description of the Hill Cumorah monument by Torley Canopus, who is the sculptor and designer, and then it goes an introduction to the maps in Moroni's America.
Right.
So let's go into this really in a little bit more detail here. So Oliver Cowdery's letter 7. Most members of the church were going, letter what?
Yeah.
And Oliver Cowdery did who?
Yeah. So, they don't know anything about it.
Give us some background on letter 7. Where did that come from?
Well, it's interesting because a few decades ago, most members of the church knew about this. In fact, I have an institute manual, seminary manual, that talks about letter 7 right in it. It was, and during a break I can get it and show you. Okay. But it was, I think that one was copyrighted in the 1970s. And since then, that's all been what I call decorrelated.
Uncoordinated?
Decorrelated. Because it was correlated at one time, now it's decorrelated. Okay, so it's not allowed anymore. Okay. But what happened is, the history of this is interesting because in 1834, there was an anti-Mormon book called Mormonism Unveiled that was published near Kirtland, Ohio.
The very first one, wasn't it?
It was the first major one, yeah. And there had been articles and things,
Right.
but critical. But this was a compilation of
An actual book.
an actual book.
Yeah.
And one of the things that it included was an assertion that the Book of Mormon was fiction, that it was copied from Solomon Spaulding. And so in response to that, it was published, as I recall, in October of 1834. And in response to that, Joseph and Oliver realized that they had never written down the history of the church and never published it anyway. And so they began writing a series of essays. They ended up writing 8 essays that were published. They were published
Joseph
as letters.
and Oliver.
Oliver was the main writer. He was,
Okay.
but he said Joseph Smith helped him with it because he didn't know a lot of the. Joseph was the only one who knew about Moroni's visit and other things, but Oliver wrote about his own experience as well.
So there's things in there that only Joseph Smith knew. So clearly, Oliver was getting that information from Joseph.
Right, and he said that right in there.
Okay.
But Oliver started off by talking about his own experience when he first met Joseph Smith, how John the Baptist came, and most members of the church are familiar with this part of this first essay because it's in the Pearl of Great Price.
Okay.
It's a footnote at the end of Joseph Smith history. And it's the one that starts, "These are days never to be forgotten," and so on.
Yeah.
And so that most members of the church have at least read that if they've studied the scriptures at all. But they don't realize that this was only part of the first of 8 essays. And so in the second essay...
So how long are these essays typically?
They vary in length, but they're 3 or 4 or maybe 7 or 8 pages. Depending on the format. They're not books.
Okay.
They were published as a book, though. The 8 essays were compiled and published as a pamphlet in England in 1844, and then they've been republished many times since. In fact, after the last one was published in 1835, Joseph had his scribes copy it into his journal. So you can read them in the Joseph Smith papers today, right out of Joseph's journal.
Okay, so let me make sure I got this right. So basically, Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery wrote it down because he was the guy that
right. He was
a scribe anyway.
He wrote the whole Book of Mormon.
The Book of Mormon and so forth. So Oliver, so clearly he knew. Not only was he the foremost knowledgeable person about how the translation happened and all that, but he also had been with Joseph all those months, and I'm sure you can imagine some of the conversations they probably had.
Oh yeah.
About what Joseph Smith had been shown and so forth, and how this book is going to change the world and so forth. But then, in addition to that, you have a guy who was there, and he's now writing this history,
right?
And he's using Joseph Smith as help,
right?
But people said that this is Joseph. Oliver Cowdery was just expressing his own opinions about all this stuff.
I know.
So Joseph Smith had nothing to do with it. Can you debunk that for?
Well, I think
to some extent. Was Joseph Smith involved with this, or was he not? Was this just Oliver Cowdery?
No, clearly Joseph Smith assisted with it, but he had his scribes copy it into his own history as part of his life story.
Which means that he had to have
He
agreed
completely
with
endorsed it. He completely endorsed it.
Just one time, then?
No, and then subsequently, and this was in 1835 when he had it copied into his own history. But then in 1841, he told Benjamin Winchester to publish it in his newspaper in Philadelphia.
That's the Gospel Reflector.
Right.
Okay.
He gave it to his brother Don Carlos to publish in the Times and Seasons. So you can read this right in the Times and Seasons in 1841.
The Times and Seasons was kind of like the enzyme of its time.
Yeah, exactly.
Basically, if Joseph Smith wanted information to get out to the membership of the church, that was his main vehicle to do it.
Right.
So Joseph Smith, not Oliver Cowdery, basically brought it to the Times and Seasons, and the Times and Seasons published these letters.
Right. And so the key point by the time he got to letter number 7, this is the one we're going to talk about that relates to the Hill Cumorah, because when you read Mormonism Unveiled, you can see all the reasons that they were saying the Book of Mormon was fiction. Mm-hmm. So Oliver Cowdery wrote these essays in the form of letters to W.W. Phelps, who was living in Missouri at the time, and he was describing where the Hill Cumorah actually was. And he says, this is on page, what page is it? 514 in the Annotated Book of Mormon is a copy of Letter 7. And he explains to him, if you go on the mail road from Palmyra down to Manchester, you pass this big hill on the left side. And he describes it in a lot of detail. Yeah. But then he says that about a mile west of this hill rises another ridge of less height. So if you go to the Hill Cumorah today and stand on the top and you look west, you see another ridge. It's about a mile away.
Yep.
And he says, at about 1 mile west rises a ridge of less height, running parallel with the former, in other words, the one you're standing on, the hill Cumorah, leaving a beautiful vale between, or valley. The soil is of the first quality for the country and under a state of cultivation, which gives a prospect at once imposing when one reflects on the fact that here, between these hills, the entire power and national strength of both the Jaredites and the Nephites were destroyed. So he explained it as a fact.
So he said it was a fact, and Joseph Smith then had this, with those words, fact, published over and over and over again, including in his own personal journal.
So you can read it in the Joseph Smith papers. Now, the interesting thing about this is, how would Oliver Cowdery know it was a fact? Well, he had said he'd been in the repository. So he had been in the actual place that Mormon referred to in Mormon 6:6, chapter 6, verse 6, where all the Nephite records were. So he knew it was a fact.
He's seen it himself. He's
plus,
been in it.
Plus, a couple of years later, when Heber C. Kimball joined the church, and he knew about this. He'd heard about the hill Cumorah. So he went to see the hill Cumorah himself. And he said he could still see the embankments around the hill from the fortifications.
Yeah.
And today, if you go there, I looked on a topographical map, and there's one little residue of it. It's a kind of a triangular shape that you can still see on the topographical maps. But it's on private land, so we're not supposed to go on there. Okay, so this, but he goes on to say,
tell us a little bit more about
in this
this.
mile-wide valley, it's right here. So in this mile-wide valley between the hill Cumorah and the one to the west, he says, in this valley fell the remaining strength and pride of a once powerful people, the Nephites. And then he goes on to say that Mormon deposited, as he says on the 529th page.
By the way, so you
in the 1830.
I'm holding in my hand here a wonderful replica of the 1830 edition of the Book of Mormon. Why didn't he just give us a chapter and verse and the book?
Because they didn't have
in the Book of Mormon, original, it didn't have that. So they actually had to go by page number. So they actually said, so this is on page
529 is today Mormon 6:6.
Yep.
So he deposited, as he says, all the records in this same hill Cumorah, which is Oliver knew because he'd been in there. He'd seen it.
All the records. That's all the Nephite and Jaredite records that they had.
Right. And after he gave his small record to his son Moroni, so he deposited all the Nephite records in the depository, and then gave the abridged record to his son Moroni.
That's this stuff here.
Yeah. Now notice he says he gave his small record to his son Moroni. He doesn't say he gave Nephi's record to Moroni.
Yeah.
He gave the abridged plates to Moroni, who, as it appears from the same, finished it and after witnessing the extinction of his people as a nation. So he explains it there. Then he goes on later to say this hill, the one we're talking about, the hill Cumorah in New York, by the Jaredites was called Ramah, and by it or around it pitched the famous army of Coriantumr, their tent. And you can go on and read the rest. So the reason this is significant is when Oliver Cowdery wrote Letter 7, he was the assistant president of the church. He was in the first presidency.
Now, we don't have an assistant president of the church anymore, so what does that mean?
Well, it means that if Joseph had become president of the church.
So he was the next in line. He would be basically what you'd consider to be the first counselor in the first presidency.
Well, they had a first and second counselor, but the assistant president was senior in authority to them. And it turns out that the other two counselors, both in different ways, also approved of these letters. But the Hiram Smith was also an assistant president of the church. And after that, as I recall, there haven't been any more assistant presidents of the church. But at the time, the point is, when he wrote this, he was a prophet, seer, and revelator. And he was the one who gave the charge to the 12 apostles when they were first ordained in 1835. So sometimes people today think of Oliver Cowdery as, he left the church, right? But at the time that this was written, he was a prophet, seer, and revelator in the first presidency, assistant president of the church. And yet scholars today say, well, he didn't know what he was talking about, or he was speculating and all this. So,
but yet, don't these same scholars basically use Oliver Cowdery's words in these same letters and other things to support their positions and their viewpoints?
Only when it supports their viewpoints. When it doesn't, they say, well, he missed this or he forgot that or whatever. So we don't need to get into the detail. I wrote a whole book about this to kind of annotate. If you just read the letters, you don't appreciate the historical context. because you have to understand the Mormonism Unveiled book and the arguments there that Albert Cowdery was responding to. So I annotated it here. I also have links on the webpage. You can just read them yourself for free in the Joseph Smith papers, and that's what I recommend people do.
Yeah.
But the reason this was important is if the Hill Cumorah is in New York, like Oliver said, then to figure out the rest of the geography, it has to start with the pin in the map of Cumorah, right?
Yeah.
So
in order for any geography to be understood, you have to have certain things that are just like the anchors.
Right.
These are the anchor points.
Yeah.
This is where this is, and if it doesn't fit, then everything else goes away.
Right. So I had a challenge from my wife after I pointed this out about the Hill Cumorah. She said, "Well, where did all the other events take place?" Right.
Yeah.
And you and I had talked about it. I talked to lots of people about it. For decades.
You've studied this for a long time. Tell us a little bit about,
decades,
your overall study, because it's pretty profound.
Yeah, well, it's pretty interesting because when I was even in high school, I wanted to know, well, where did all this take place, right? And so back then in high school, everybody said, well, Hill Cumorah is in New York, but North America, it's kind of the Orson Pratt idea, the hemispheric idea. That North America was the land of the Nephites, South America was the land of the Lamanites, and I was kind of like, okay, it seems kind of weird.
There was a lot of that back in the early days of the church.
Yeah,
too.
there was.
People who believed in basically all of the Americas was the land of the Nephites.
And a lot of it is because a neck of land was described in the culture at the time as Panama.
Yeah.
And so when the Book of Mormon used that same phrase, everybody assumed it was Panama. Joseph Smith never said that, but other people made that inference. And so I took I started with First Nephi, and all the way through in that Moronites America book to see, I was testing the Book of Mormon to see if it made a description of a geography that would fit with New York as Cumorah. Mm-hmm. And I was really surprised to see how well it described North America. And I went through it verse by verse. I didn't accept anybody else's interpretation. I just read the text for myself. Mm-hmm. And I had 3 basic rules of interpretation. One was that different words mean different things. Like a narrow neck is not the same as a small neck. Otherwise, they'd use the same word.
Which is not the same as a narrow passage.
Yeah, exactly.
So, right.
Or even a narrow neck of land. It's not the same as a narrow neck, right? And then another one was I assumed that geographical terms that looked relative in grammar are relative. So a land northward and a land southward is relative to where the speaker is. Like we're sitting here in Provo. If we were down in St. George, this would be the land northward. If we're in Salt Lake, it's the land southward. And so whenever you read those terms in the Book of Mormon, you have to understand where they're what they're referring to as the center, to have a land northward and land southward. So that can change over time. And the third was, I assumed that the Nephites traveled mostly by water, by rivers. And that's because ancient people traveled by rivers. And it explains, as just a small detail, several times there's accounts of people fleeing and someone's chasing after them and they lose them right away. Mm-hmm. But if you're following someone through dense foliage, you're not going to lose their trail, right? But if they're on a river, you lose them at the first turn because there's always different branches of a river and you can lose people immediately and there's no tracks. So that's an example of how you can understand the Book of Mormon much better with those 3 assumptions.
And understand it as a conveyance. In fact, in the annotated Book of Mormon here we have a page of the beautiful
the painting of it.
Of the painting. And tell us a little bit more
about
that.
That's pretty awesome.
I'll find it while you...
Okay, because when Mormon was a young boy, Amaron said he noticed that he was, wise, or well, not wise. What was the word he used? Anyway, he
was young, but
he was young, but he noticed that he was paying attention to what was going on, essentially. Yeah. And he said, when you're 24 years old, you need to go and get these records and update them with what you've observed in your life. Yeah, sober mind, something like that.
Yeah, a sober child.
So his father took him on a field trip, and they left from the area around Cumorah, which is roughly in upstate New York, western New York, and went all the way to Zarahemla. And along that, and I think the reason he did that was so he could show his son the entire territory of the Nephites so that he would understand the record better, just like we take kids on field trips today. We take them to Washington, D.C. so they understand American history. So Mormon's father took him on this field trip. And it says he carried him, right? He carried but he didn't literally hold him and carry him. He conveyed him. They went on a boat down the river, basically down the Ohio River to the Mississippi and then up to Zarahemla. And so along this trip, there's a painting of this on page 432 in the Annotated Book of Mormon.
This is by Ken Corbett. It's just absolutely beautiful. Yeah.
Mormon was carried by my father to the land of Zarahemla. So they went down this river, the Ohio River, essentially, to the Mississippi River. He saw all the lands of the Nephites, and that was the border between the Nephites and the Lamanites, so that he could understand the whole history of the Nephites.
And apparently, almost everywhere they went, I mean, he was seeing city after city after town after, and they were all along the rivers that's how it was.
That's how people lived.
I mean, you needed to have water. It had fish. It had transportation.
Yep.
And so,
this painting kind of depicts all that.
Exactly.
It's awesome.
So you just defend those areas along the sides of the rivers, and so Amron took him and conveyed him basically, like you're saying.
So the really cool thing, we don't have time to get into the whole geography of it, but what's exciting about this is when you read through the Book of Mormon, and you can interpret it multiple ways. That's why you have some people who say it took place in Chile, Peru, Panama, Mesoamerica, Baja California, Eritrea, Malaysia. You can interpret a text to mean lots of different things. Yeah. And so people like down there, I hate to say Book of Mormon Central, but those people claim
that what?
Book of Mormon Central America.
Central America.
But they claim that they stick with the text. And that's a completely preposterous idea, because they don't stick with the text. They stick with their interpretation of the text. Yeah. And everybody that has an idea is interpreting the text. And so as soon as you liberate yourself from someone else's interpretation and read it for yourself, you can make sense of it. And that's why this Hill Cumorah as a pin in the map is so critical.
Yeah, and let me just make just a little comment. In one of the previous podcasts, talking about the Lehi's dream of the tree of life and so forth, and there was a guy, and he was following the guy, and he got, but then he basically kind of got lost in the mist of darkness, basically.
Right.
It wasn't until he stopped looking at the guy. And put his eyes on the tree, that he then was able to make that himself and realize that I have to find my own way to the tree.
That's right.
So what we're saying, I think, here is that my brothers and sisters, we are here to share information and that kind of thing, but you shouldn't take our words or any scholar's words. Right. I don't care if they're from BYU or whoever they're from. If they go against what the scriptures themselves say, or what the prophets and apostles have said by revelation and so forth, you can set them aside.
Well, you make up your own mind. And so the point, though, is that if you start with the Hill Cumorah in New York, the Book of Mormon fits perfectly in North America.
It does. It's beautiful.
And that's the gist of it. So the follow-up question, though, is why are we looking in Central America, right? And there's really two answers to that. The first is that there were articles published in the Times and Seasons in 1842 that referred to ruins in Central America as Book of Mormon ruins. Yeah,
people say, well, Joseph Smith was the author, the writer.
Exactly.
He sat there and set every piece of type on that press and everything. I mean, that's what you get from the end plate, basically, on every edition of the Times and Seasons.
The Times and Seasons, at the very end, the boilerplate said, the Times and Seasons is edited, published, and printed by Joseph Smith, essentially. Yeah. There were two different ones. But no one believes he ran the operated the printing press.
In fact, we know that he wasn't.
Well, he would have to set type. If he printed the Times and Seasons, he'd have to set the type and run the press. And so he was a nominal printer, which means in name only. Just like he was a nominal editor. He never edited anything in there. Right. The only thing he contributed to it were things like what we call the Wentworth letter, which was called Church History at the time, that
which was attributed
signed.
To him.
Well, he signed
had
it.
His signature on it.
And there were a few other things that he signed. The rest of it he had no involvement with. And so that, when I was interested in what happened, where did these articles come from that talked about Central America, it led me into the whole Benjamin Winchester saga, which we don't have time to talk about today. But from there, the other interesting thing there is that those articles were never cited for decades because everybody realized they were just kind of speculation.
Yeah.
But none of those articles questioned the Hill Cumorah in New York. No one ever
Right.
questioned that.
Right. That was always a given.
That was always a given until the late 1800s. And in the late 1800s...
So who started this trend?
This Hill Cumorah thing is real interesting because after Joseph Smith died, there was a schism in the church, and Brigham Young became the successor for most of the members of the church, but not all of them. Mm-hmm. And he went out to Utah. A lot of the saints followed him, but others stayed in. They followed James Strang. Some followed Sidney Rigdon for a while.
Right.
And then there was, when Joseph Smith's son, Joseph Smith III, they asked him to become the leader of the church, and he didn't feel like he was supposed to do that until he turned 27 years old.
Yeah.
When he turned 27 years old, he reorganized the church. That's why it was called the Reorganized Church. And let me get into
get this.
I will.
Yeah.
Because there became a very fierce competition between the Reorganized Church and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Utah. And one of the issues they fought over was polygamy. Mm-hmm. And another issue was the Hill Cumorah, because the Reorganized Church had scholars who said that when they studied the Book of Mormon, it had to be in Central America. But Hill Cumorah in New York.
Where did they get that idea from?
Well, that's a longer story. We don't have time to get all into it.
Let me just give it a little quickie here, because back in Joseph Smith's day, there were people, and I want to bring this up because this is an in-depth study.
Yeah.
Okay, but basically there were three individuals back in Joseph Smith's day. One of them we call the smoking gun because his name was Benjamin Winchester, and Winchester being a gun, right? So Benjamin Winchester, John Page, and Joseph Smith's little brother William. Right. These three guys colluded to put those articles in the Times and Seasons that you were mentioning before. Yeah. And that happened about three different times, and each time that happened, Joseph Smith kind of ratcheted up his response to what they had done. The first time, he basically kind of slapped their hands and so forth. The second time it happened, he told Benjamin Winchester that he was silenced from any further preaching. Yeah, okay. But that's more detail than I wanted to get into, because the point is that Central America theory basically started at Joseph Smith's time, but then it kind of died out. Not really. Let me address that real quick. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Benjamin Winchester and these guys were very zealous missionaries, and so they thought that if they alluded to the Central American ruins, it would get people to read the Book of Mormon, which is exactly the New York Times best-selling book about the Central American ruins called Incidents of Travel in Central America. Right,
and so that became generally accepted in the church. That's where this hemispheric idea came up, and so as I was saying, these RLDS scholars said, well, okay, if the Book of Mormon took place in Central America, then the Hill Cumorah is too far away.
Yeah, there's no way. It's 4,000 miles away.
So therefore it has to be in Mexico. And in 1917, one of the scholars named Hills, his last name was Hills, L.E. Hills, published a map that showed the Book of Mormon sites all in Central America, including the Hill Cumorah.
Is it 1917?
1917, wow. Yeah. And Joseph Fielding Smith, who was a church historian and an apostle for 20 years, said, well, that's ridiculous because the Hill Cumorah is in New York. And he wrote an editorial about all this. In the meantime, Joseph F. Smith was trying to purchase the Hill Cumorah in New York. And the RLDS are saying, no, it doesn't matter because the real Hill Cumorah is in Mexico. So it was this tension between those two that kind of led to this problem.
The church ultimately did buy the Hill Cumorah in New York. Yeah. And then the RLDS church could point at them and say, see, look at those knuckleheads. They bought the wrong hill.
That's right. And so it's interesting when you read the teachings of the Brethren in General Conference, they reaffirmed the Hill Cumorah in New York. At the same time, the RLDS are saying, no, it's in Mexico. Then, roughly in the 1950s or so, some LDS scholars started saying, well, maybe the RLDS are right in the first place. And so they developed a theory and a geography and everything, which kind of culminated in John Sorensen's books about Central America, which most of the LDS scholars now have accepted as de facto truth, that there's two Comoras, they call it. They said they recognize that Joseph and Oliver and the other brethren all identified the Hill Cumorah in New York, but they're saying, well, that was just a false tradition because the real Hill Cumorah is in Mexico. And so basically they've adopted the RLDS position, and they've rejected what the brethren have taught. And so as a result, and the thing that's interesting for me is that the people at Book of Mormon Central and the Interpreter and BYU Studies, all those people who promote this Mesoamerican two Comoras, which I call M2C, they have the same motivation that Winchester and William Smith had, because they think they're doing missionary work. They think they're promoting faith.
Questions about the Book of Mormon.
And yet what they're teaching is that the prophets were wrong. So when
Oliver Cowdery didn't get it right.
Well, not only Oliver Cowdery, all the others.
Own opinion.
Yeah. Everybody, all the other, including members of the First Presidency and General Conference, they were all wrong because these scholars know better.
Well, how could these scholars basically have so much influence that it actually now that you see this stuff? I mean, we have, for example, the even saints, the new history of saints. I mean, they completely scrubbed the word Cumorah right out of the book. It's not even in saints.
Yeah, they changed church history to accommodate this.
And you actually kind of called them on that, and they said, well, it had nothing to do with this geography stuff. And then they said, no, we're trying to be geography neutral.
Right.
And you know that there's some people who don't believe that that's the Hill Cumorah in New York is the actual hill. Yeah. And so we're trying to accommodate them.
Yeah.
But my feeling is these are church historians. They're not supposed to be trying to pick winners and losers on the geography side.
Right.
They should be telling us what the history says.
Yeah.
And instead, they're literally changing the history to accommodate this idea of the Book of Mormon, Hill Cumorah being in Mexico someplace.
Yeah, that's right. So the gist of my effort in all this is to say no one has to believe what these scholars say. We're not bound. We never sustained the scholars, right? Mm-hmm. But we should read and study what the prophets have said and what the scriptures have said. And as long as we stick with that, we won't be misled. You know, even when the scholars tell us that the prophets were wrong, we can be misled by the scholars, right? But when the prophets are as clear as they have been about it, I stick with that. And the nice thing, the really cool thing about it is that what the prophets taught about the Hill Cumorah is corroborated not only by the text of the Book of Mormon that describes North America, but by all the archaeology, anthropology, geography, geology. Yeah. All the sciences corroborate what the prophets have taught.
Not only that, but to me, the most powerful thing is that the United States is the promised land. It is the covenant nation.
Yeah, right.
And that has been upheld over and over and over again. Yeah. Again, regardless of what some scholar, even if they're from BYU, says, it doesn't change the fact that the United States is the promised land. This was originally the land of Adam and Eve. This is where the Jaredites, the Nephites, and so forth, and this covenant has existed the whole time.
Well, for purposes of this, though, what I want to encourage the readers to do is learn a little bit about how the Book of Mormon fits in North America, because it completely changes our understanding of the text.
It's exciting.
It's exciting, and it's cool. It's the history of ancient America, and it's ancient North America, which would otherwise be completely unknown because they didn't have written records. Yeah. The only written records that they had were destroyed by the Lamanites and preserved in the Hill Cumorah in New York.
Which is another, I think it's just a fascinating aspect that you have brought up. Yeah. That people have said, well, the Book of Mormon couldn't have happened in North America because there's no record of people who are literate.
Yeah, I know.
Because there's no writings and so forth. But down in Central America, we got writings all over the place. Every wall has writings, and every edifice and so forth has writings on it, which actually is kind of funny because it shows that that's not the Nephites people.
That's right.
Because according to the Book of Mormon, the Lamanites were absolutely bound and determined to destroy any aspect of their history.
That's right.
They would have had to destroy all of those walls and all those frescoes and all of those edifices and so forth. They have all this writing all over it. And instead, in North America, it matches exactly what the Book of Mormon said, that the Lamanites were determined to destroy their history.
That's right.
But the history of the Mayans is all over everything.
Yep. I know.
It's so funny how.
But I want to make sure that we're clear about one thing: that people can believe whatever they want.
Absolutely.
People can have a strong testimony of the Book of Mormon, even if they believe Mesoamerica or Peru or Chile or where Easter Bunny. Well, but I mean, the geography is not what drives a testimony.
true.
The reason I think it's important is, for me, the whole Mesoamerican thing is not even believable. And therefore,
it's doing damage to the church.
Well, yeah.
In my opinion. Yeah.
And it forces people like BYU and CES to create these fantasy maps where they're teaching the kids the Book of Mormon by a fictional map. And yet they're trying to tell them it's a real history, but it took place in a fictional area.
And they'd say, well, this fantasy map, basically, it meets every geographical requirement of the Book of Mormon, but it just doesn't happen to match up with any place on Earth.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, what does that tell the kids? Oh my gosh,
I know.
that this place
and the sad
doesn't
thing
really
is,
exist.
The sad thing is that fantasy map is based on the Mesoamerican interpretation.
And how many pins in the map does that have? How many things can you say? Okay, this is a real world place, and this is where this was in the Book of Mormon.
Zero.
There's zero.
Yeah.
But the one place where we all should be able to agree, based on at least what Oliver Cowdery, which was with Joseph Smith and so forth, and every prophet in this dispensation, and then and numerous other evidences around and through the Hill Cumorah, basically all indicates that this was the place. This is that pin in the map, and the fantasy map that is being used now with CES and so forth. They basically are showing Hill Cumorah in some.
Well, there's one other point to be clear on too, and that is that we are not claiming any prophetic support for our theories whatsoever. Right. What we're trying to do is support what the prophets have taught. It's the other way around. Yeah. And so, whereas the Book of Mormon Central, they're always claiming that they have the support of the church and that the brethren approve of what they're doing, which even though they're contradicting the church's position. And so it's important to recognize that too, because we're not claiming the prophets support anything that we're saying. Instead, we're trying to support the prophets. And
if you want to find out for sure what the answer is, then ask.
Yeah, that's right.
Ask the Lord.
That's right.
Was Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith wrong about the Hill Cumorah?
Yeah.
Was every one of these prophets, was the church wrong when they bought the actual hill in New York and called it the Hill Cumorah? Were they wrong to put up a visitor center there, or to have a pageant there for many years?
Yeah. Well, we're probably into overtime, but the bottom line is we want people to make informed decisions. Don't just accept what someone says, even if it's in a lesson manual, because I have lesson manuals that show the Hill Cumorah is in New York too. Yes. So study it for yourselves, make up your own minds, but primarily focus on the scriptures themselves and what the prophets have taught.
And that is the best advice.
And then ask the Lord.
Yeah. And by the way, if you like additional information here, again, I didn't bring it up here, but there's a DVD that I was actually asked to do about 2.5 years ago or so. That I was asked to go and speak to the pageant cast members at the Hill Cumorah. Mm-hmm. And they asked me, so what archaeological evidence is there?
Yeah.
What about the bones? Where's the head plates? Where's the breastplates? How come the hill's so small? They talked about it being able to see this huge place and so forth. All of those questions have really beautiful answers. If you want to get that, the DVD is called The Hill Cumorah.
You can put that up on
verifications and realistic archaeological expectations.
Right.
Also, I've talked about it at some of the events. So if you have Book of Mormon evidence streaming, you can see some of those things. You can also hear Jonathan talk about.
Yeah, I've talked about all the maps and everything there.
And you see the maps, and you get the information. Yeah. But brothers and sisters, we just ask that you just become as informed as possible.
Yeah.
And then ask the Lord for verification. Yep. And that's the best way to do it.
Very
Jonathan,
good.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
We sure
Fun
appreciate
to be here.
you.
Happy to
God
be here.
God bless you in all your travels and what you're
Thanks.
doing. And thank you. And by the way, if you want to see Jonathan, he's speaking again at the conference.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
So it's going to be exciting, to see you there.
Yep.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week with another edition of the Come Follow Me podcast series by Book of Mormon Evidence. Thank you for watching.
Thank you for listening to the Book of Mormon Evidence podcast. If you like this Come Follow Me supplemental study, click the like button and share it with your friends. Be sure to go to bookofmormonevidence.org, which is a hub with all the links that you would like to the podcasts, to upcoming events, the store, 200 plus answers about the Book of Mormon, as well as links to our streaming site, which now has over 100 new videos from our virtual expo. If you want to see the expo, go to comefollowme2020.org, and you can also see them on the streaming site, bookofmormonevidencestreaming.com.